Story of the World, Volume 3, Chapter 6, New Colonies in the New World, Part 1, Strangers and Saints in Plymouth. While Henry Hudson was searching for the Northwest Passage in Canada, and the Jamestown colonists were struggling for survival in Virginia, in England, a young man named William Bradford was making a difficult decision to leave his home country forever. William Bradford was a Puritan, an English Protestant who wanted the Church of England purified of everything borrowed from the Catholic Church, including candles, incense, altars, priests, and prayer books. But unlike other Puritans, Bradford and his friends had given up hope that the Church of England would ever be purified. So they separated from the English Church and held their own services. Other Englishmen called them separatists. King James forced separatists to pay high taxes. He told separatists that they could not use church buildings. William and his friends had to meet in barns and stables. And William knew that the king's soldiers would take any opportunity to arrest them and throw him in jail. So he and the other separatists decided to leave England and go to a country where they could worship God in their own way, and in freedom. Where would they go? Holland. The homeland of the Dutch welcomed Protestants, and since Holland was so close to England, the journey would not be long. William Bradford and the other separatists packed their belongings and families into a tiny wooden ship and sailed across the North Sea to Holland. They settled down in a small Dutch town called Leiden. Here, the separatists were free to meet together in churches. They didn't have to pay extra taxes or worry about being arrested. William Bradford soon married another English separatist, a young woman named Dorothy. Together, they had a son named John. But in Leiden, little John Bradford and the other separatist children learned to speak Dutch. They played with Dutch friends and learned to wear wooden shoes and to skate on the icy canals. They began to forget English and their separatist beliefs as well. Some of the children were drawn away from their parents, William Bradford later wrote. Some became soldiers, others ran away to sea. Others took even worse courses, further from the ways of their fathers. William Bradford and the other separatist fathers wanted to take their families to a country where they could raise their children as good English separatists. But they couldn't go back to England. So where could they go? What about North America, they said to each other. The English who settled in Jamestown are free to do as they please. If we travel to North America, we too could establish our own colony, a place where every citizen obeys God. The journey to North America was long and dangerous, but 50 of the separatists were willing to go. Their leaders traveled back to England and went to visit rich English merchants. Supply us money to buy a boat and food, the separatists promised, and we'll share with you all the gold and jewels we find in our new homeland. Several merchants agreed to pay for the ship and supplies, on one condition. The 50 separatists had to take along 60 other settlers. 50 men, women, and children couldn't establish a colony all alone. The separatists met the other settlers for the first time as they all boarded their new ship, the Mayflower. They called these new colonists strangers and called themselves saints. But William Bradford used another name. He called the whole group of settlers pilgrims, Christians on a holy quest to build a colony where God would be worshipped. Today, we often borrow Bradford's name and call the whole group of settlers, strangers and saints alike, the Pilgrims. The Mayflower sailed from England in 1620. William and Dorothy were aboard, but they left little John in Holland, where he would be safe. They knew that the new colony would be a perilous place to live. After many cold, miserable days at sea, the Mayflower sighted land ahead. The Pilgrims had arrived at their new home. But before leaving the ship, the Pilgrims sat down together and drew up a set of laws for their new colony. They wanted to be sure that both strangers and saints would follow the same rules. This Mayflower Compact said that all colonists must agree together before a law could be passed, and that once laws were passed, each colonist would obey with all due submission and obedience. Almost every man on the Mayflower signed this compact, and then, together, the Saints and the strangers elected a separatist, John Carver, to be their governor. At first, the women and children stayed on the Mayflower while Bradford and others went out exploring. Finally, the explorers found the perfect place for the new colony. Cornfields were already planted there. A freshwater stream flowed nearby. They even found the remains of a few houses made of saplings bent into arches and thrust into the ground, and then covered with thick mats made of reeds. It was an Indian village deserted several years before. They returned to the Mayflower, shouting out the news of their great find. But the women who came running to meet them were weeping. While the men were exploring, Dorothy Bradford had fallen overboard and drowned. William Bradford had little time for grief. Winter was coming, and the Pilgrims had to build log houses for their families. The work was hard and slow. The food they had brought with them from England, dried biscuits, beans, pork soaked in salt water, began to run out. They began to die from fever, scurvy, and starvation. Sometimes 2 or 3 died in one day, William Bradford wrote of these times. But then the Native Americans who lived nearby took pity on these newcomers. Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoag tribe, was willing to be friendly. One of his warriors, Squanto, could speak English. So Squanto helped Massasoit and the Englishmen make a treaty, in which they swore not to hurt each other. Squanto himself showed the Pilgrims how to grow crops in their new fields. William Bradford wrote, "He showed them how to set the corn in the ground and how to tend it when it came up. Also he told them, if they did not put a fish in the ground with the seed for fertilizer, in these long-used fields it would come to nothing." Starvation was averted, but the young colony, which the English named Plymouth Plantation, was still a risky place to live. One hot day, Governor John Carver was laboring in the cornfields when his head began to hurt. When he came in, he lay down to rest, and soon slipped into unconsciousness. Only a few days later, John Carver died. The colonists elected William Bradford to be their new leader. Bradford worked hard to make the colony successful. He planted crops, bought food from English trading boats that sailed by, and treated the Native Americans with friendship. By the fall of Bradford's first year as governor, the colony finally was beginning to prosper. Their crops, watched over by Squanto, had grown well and the harvest was plentiful. The Pilgrims built fires, cooked a huge feast of corn, wild turkey, fish, and deer, and invited Massasoit and 90 other Wampanoag Indians to be their guests. At this first Thanksgiving feast, the Pilgrim gave thanks to God for their survival. Soon, more Puritans would come to the New World, seeking the freedom to worship God in their own way. North of Plymouth Plantation, over 2,000 Puritans formed a second Puritan settlement, called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Today, Plymouth Plantation and the Massachusetts Bay Colony are both part of the state of Massachusetts.